what kind of style you have around structure and flexibility, and creating systems that actually work for you instead of working against you. Because a lot of people, they'll say like, oh, I don't like the word systems. That sounds rigid. It doesn't have to be rigid if you create it in a way that's going to work for you and your tendencies, rather than just trying to fit into somebody else's mold.
All right, Lauren, I am so excited to have you here. I know you and I just like chit-chatted for 15, 20 minutes before we get on. And just that's the nature of this. Like, this is what I love about the podcast, is being able to just have conversations, meet people, dive into what's working in your life, in your business, and then being able to bring that to the podcast. And so I know in this episode, we're going to bring to the podcast so much of what's working in your business and like these systems and things that other people can then use and really amplify to be able to produce more in less hours, which I'm all about too. So thanks so much for coming on.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. So before we dive into all about like systems, which I know sometimes isn't all that sexy, right? Like people are like, I don't need systems, but really systems are the key to decreasing your busy work and the things that you're doing so that you can actually spend your time doing the things you want to be doing. But before we do that, would you mind sharing just a little bit about you and your business, like how you serve people, all of those types of things?
Yeah, for sure. And I definitely understand that we can dive into how you can make systems and processes work for you, even if you're not a system oriented person. But for me, yeah, I started out as a teacher. I was running basically a teaching membership. So I was creating teaching resources, lesson plans, things like that for teachers. And I was also teaching, and I had my son. So I was balancing all of those things. And I remember just hitting, I'm sure you can probably relate to this, Renee, but I remember I didn't know it at the time, but I was completely burnt out.
Mm-hmm.
I remember laying down on my son's little play structure that we had in our backyard, like looking up at the sky and just feeling so stressed out. Like I was going to throw up. Like I was so stressed out. I don't know if you've ever felt like that before, and I was just trying to throw up and like trying to calm down. And I didn't know what was wrong with me. And it was a long process. Hormones were included, knowing your podcast. But one of the things that I realized is I was trying to do a lot, and I didn't have like systems and processes set up so that I could actually do it with more ease and make it simpler on myself, because I was going 110% on everything. And so that was kind of my first foray into this idea of what I now call like the AC effort strategy. So giving A-level effort, because I think even my entrepreneur clients will understand this, because a lot of them were really high achieving straight A students when they were young. And the AC effort strategy is this idea of giving A-level effort, the best creative problem-solving effort to some things, and then C-level effort, making it simpler, simplifying, streamlining the things that don't matter as much. And that was the thing that really made a big difference for me, is when I started to do that in my work, then I was able to run, like I had to let go of my membership, to be perfectly honest. But that's when I started to really make a big impact on running my business and teaching. And I brought that into my teaching my actual teaching membership later. So I let go of the teaching resources and I started teaching teachers in a group coaching program how they can stop working too much at school, basically, how they can simplify, how they can streamline their teaching. So that's what I was starting to do. I left my teaching job and I started doing that full time as a mentor for teachers. And I help them. Like I've had teachers who were working like 3, 4, 5 hours every evening, cut it down to like 4 or 5 minutes after school. So that's huge, awesome. Huge difference. And then now I've started working with entrepreneurs doing something similar. So helping them put in systems and planning and structure into their business so that they can have more freedom, so they can have more creativity, and they don't feel so bogged down in their business.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, honestly, no matter where people are at, everybody could probably use enhancing their systems and enhancing their structure, right? I know for me, we were even just talking about it. Like went through a program and I like outlined and had my launch all systematized out and structured. And so when I was thinking about launching, like oftentimes people think like, oh, launching is so much work and launching is so much effort. And when I sat down to look at like, do I really want to launch in July this summer? I was like, I don't want to spend time away from my family. I want to be able to focus on them. Like, I don't want it to be all this added stuff. And I was like, I literally have an Excel sheet and I have the folder and I have the files, like everything's ready to go. Like the structure's all there. My assistant can plug it all in and then I don't have to do anything. And so it allows me to actually show up with that capacity, right? Like you maybe put in the effort and the time building the system and building the structure in the first place, but then it becomes this exponential thing that now I can spend my time on other things and I can spend my time really investing and growing in other ways rather than that busy work. And I think that is probably, I don't know about you, but I think that's probably one of the biggest roadblocks for a lot of entrepreneurs is the busy work and just trying to keep up with all of the, even like checking your emails or checking social media or all of those little pieces that take your time away from the things that are actually moving the needle forward in your business. So I would love to know, what do you feel like if there were one or two major systems or structure, like things people could integrate into their business that's going to help them get time back? Where would you start? What would you start with first?
Well, that is such a great question. The first thing I would say is to think about where you are. I think of it as a spectrum where you are in terms of being structured or more free flowing, and that'll kind of impact what kinds of systems that I would recommend. But the main thing is to think about, are you the kind of person who naturally likes systems, likes structure, likes routine, and you like things really structured on one side of the equation? Or are you the kind of entrepreneur who likes to be really free flowing and have lots of creativity and freedom and openness, and you don't want to be tied down? Or are you somewhere in the middle? Yeah. So for me, I know that I am somewhere in the middle where I like to have freedom within structure. So the more structure I have, the more freedom and openness and creativity I can have in my business. So the first thing is to really think about where you are and how you can make your business really work for you. So that'd be the first thing I would have people really think about for them. Okay. And so then the next thing to think about for me when I'm thinking about systems is I think of it as having two phases. So like the first phase is thinking about your own systems and what you need in your own habits. And then phase two is about your business. So for me, the first thing I think about when I'm talking with entrepreneurs and their own self is to look at how you're spending your time. And I call it the intentional 10 system. So spending 10 minutes at the beginning of your week and planning out your time. And that can save you a lot of time because you don't have what I call mental negotiation. So you don't have that. I don't know if you've ever experienced this, if you're listening, but that thing of, maybe I should write an email right now. Oh, but I didn't finish that Instagram post, but I also have to do this thing for my program. And then you're kind of like bouncing from thing to thing. So that avoids that, and you know what you need to do. So you have your rhythm that you're following for the week. So that's the first thing that I recommend. Does that make sense so far? And then the second thing is to look at, when you're looking at your business for phase two, what's the thing that's really taking up a lot of your time, that's taking away from the things that are really making the biggest impact, or the things that really light you up, that make the biggest impact in your business? So for example, one thing that could be content creation. Like I had a client who has really fantastic content, but it was taking her a lot of time. So creating a system where she repurposed with her VA. She was taking once a week, she repurposes a piece of content, and then she creates the content like 2 days of the week, and then her VA puts it together. And so she's cutting down drastically on the time that she's spending on content creation, but she's still creating new content. So it really depends on where your time is going, but looking at where you're spending your time and finding a system that's going to make the biggest impact first. So that might be content creation or emails or customer service. Where are you spending a lot of your time, and where could you use a system to make it simpler?
Yeah. Well, and I think that was one of the big things that you drive home is like there are a lot of experts out there will talk about like hiring a VA. And I love my VA. Like she does so much for me and she cuts down so much time for me. But not everybody has that capacity. One, even just to go out and find a VA or to hire a VA, or I mean, like, honestly, if you can, it's one of the most powerful things that you can do in your business to like offload. But if you're not in that space, like, this is where I think what you're talking about can be incredibly valuable, to feel like you have a VA, even when you don't.
Yeah. And the thing that I learned the hard way when I said the gurus told me when I first started my business, you need to hire a VA. And I've never had my business without my kids. And so I thought, okay, I need to hire a VA. But because I didn't know where my time should be spent and how my time should be spent, I didn't have systems in place to even manage my own time. It just exponentially wasted more time and resources because I had a VA, but I didn't know what they should necessarily be doing. And then I spent all this time managing a VA instead of doing the things that I actually needed to do. So once you can get clear on where your time should be spent and stop wasting your own time, then you can move to a VA later on when it makes sense. But you can start like the intentional 10 I teach, like it can save you 2 hours just by avoiding all of that mental negotiation throughout your week.
Yeah. Well, and I think for me, particularly with knowing where your cycle's at, helps with like laying out what those things are in the week that you should be focusing on each week to week to week. So what would you say are some of those key things that people should be focusing on, or those key things that you should like almost create a structure and system for first? Because I think that that's where, when I talk with clients, sometimes I'll hear them, they're like, oh, well, I need to figure out like building a website or creating business cards or, whatever it might be. Like they come up with these ideas of things that they think are the most important to help move the needle forward in their business. So where do you see that entrepreneurs or even like solopreneurs, because I think that's a lot of my audience, are those people that are like starting out their business, they're running things on their own, have maybe a VA, but don't, and they want to help build some of that structure in, where would you recommend they start first?
Yeah. So that is such a big question. And I think like knowing where you should be spending your time is so huge because there's so many things that we could do to build a business. Again, it can feel really, really overwhelming. And so that's when I look at a couple of things is first, I mean, coming back to what you were talking about with your cycle, I found like I wanted to use my cycle to help me in my business, but I found like I had so many things to get done first that it would always like that piece of my cycle would be done and I wouldn't manage to get to it. So having a weekly rhythm where you make time if you want to be batching, for example, like I like to batch like my Instagram content in the first phase of my cycle, and I like to batch my podcast and the second phase of my cycle. So having like a weekly rhythm where maybe I like to do it on Thursday, where that's a batching day, and I have it already built into my week. So you're not trying to like fit it into the cracks and crevices of your week, if that makes sense. Like it makes more sense if you can create like kind of like that rock that you're putting in at the beginning, like when you're planning out your week. So that's the first, is to have a weekly rhythm that supports what you want to do. But the other, and I mean, you can help maybe if you're in Renee's program, I'm sure she can help you with this, is looking at your bigger goals and then planning backwards, like having that backwards design. So then you know where you should be spending your time. So say you're planning out your quarter or you're planning out your month. What's your goal for the month? Because sometimes a quarter can be overwhelming, I think, when you're starting out and you don't even know like where you're going. A month can be easier. But knowing where your month is, okay, what's the goal that I want to create at the end of this month? What's my one priority, my one focus that's going to move my business forward? Usually at the beginning, it might be something income related, right? So what's the income generating thing that I'm going to do this month? And then you plan backwards from there. So if I want to create this, when am I going to do this? What am I going to do each week? What's going to be the priority each week that's going to lead me there? And then from there, choosing your days. Because one mistake that I have seen, and I don't know if when you're listening, if this might be you, is a lot of entrepreneurs I work with will just jump into the day, and they might have like a lot of people are like, oh, well, I have a morning routine. I meditate and I go running and I make my healthy breakfast and all that kind of stuff. And I'm like, yes, but do you have a morning routine for prioritizing like that CEO time? So having time in your week and in your day where you're looking ahead, like this is what I'm doing for the month, then I'm prioritizing for the week, and then I'm prioritizing for the day, and it's leaving space for that as opposed to just jumping in without any kind of compass guiding you.
Yeah, I love that. And so I know you kind of pulling back to this idea of like the people that are more in that structure, like they like time blocking, they like batching everything out like that, versus that person that's in a little bit more flow. I tend to be probably in the middle like you, but a little bit more in the flow range and like liking things a little bit more flow. And I do know a lot of my clients are in that same way. I think that's why they like coming to work with me, is because a lot of the rigid time blocking structures and things like that don't work for them. They don't like that. That doesn't feel good. And so they tend to be more in this flow. And like you said, it is a little bit about having some structure within the flow. So for those that are feeling a little bit more of this flow and thinking like, okay, what does that look like? How do they create these, like you said, you're like batching out your time and batching out you're like putting those blocks in time in there, those core rocks. How does that shift and change for those people that are in that more flow space?
That's such a good question. So yeah, first, like identifying that and being okay with it, because I think a lot of, the traditional time management, I say that in air quotes, or the way of structuring or systematizing or organizing, it's very structured, and it leans very to the person who likes things a little bit, for lack of a better word, rigid, right? Who likes things really, really structured. And if you're more free flowing, it could feel like that sounds restrictive. That sounds boring. What if I want to change my mind? And it doesn't work, right? So what I recommend there is like knowing where you're at. And I do recommend planning out your week. And some people even go like, I don't want to do that, Lauren. But if you're going to plan out your week, if you're on the really structured side, you might say, okay, these are my 3 priorities, and this is when I'm going to do them. And you might time block out every piece of your week. So you might have, 15 hours of work a week to work. And so you might say every hour is already predetermined. But if you're more free flowing, you could say, okay, these are my 3 priorities for the week, and I'm going to make sure that I get them done on Monday and on Tuesday and on Wednesday, but it doesn't matter exactly when I do it. Or I could say you could have a rhythm where on Monday and Tuesday are my client days, and then on Wednesday and Thursday are my more administrative planning, content creation days. But within that, I have a lot more flexibility. So having like wider parameters is the first thing. And the other is, and this is so overlooked, and this is the reason that I used to stress myself out, like going back to the story that I shared at the beginning, was buffer time. Is people will feel like they need to plan things out so tightly, and then when you over plan, you feel stressed out. So if you're a more flexible person, and like I am naturally a bit more flexible too, is having buffer time. So you would say maybe 2 hours on a Thursday, or the whole day if you're more flexible, and saying like, if I don't finish this priority, I know it can flow into this time. Or if I set my priorities for the week, it doesn't matter exactly what I do it, because I know I have this buffer time. So those are 2 things that I would say is not necessarily time blocking, but having that priority for your day, or what your main top 3 are that you're going to do in the day. And then also having the weekly rhythms and a buffer time in every week, so that you have space and breathing room.
Yeah, I am so glad you brought that up, because I know that was definitely something I've had some of my clients ask too, is like, they are really good about the planning part and really good about figuring out where things are going to go, but that things don't always take necessarily the time they think that they're going to take. And so then they get to the end of this time block or like the time where they've allocated, and the project's not done. And so they're feeling frustrated with, I had the time, I put it on the calendar, I was there and I focused, but I didn't get enough of it done. So do you have any tips or strategies? I know the buffer room is great, and like having some of that buffer room for people to be able to get better at predicting and knowing how much time that each task or different thing is going to take, and how do they accommodate so that they're like planning appropriately, and not maybe putting a 2-hour task in a 15-minute block and then feeling frustrated that it didn't get done, or over planning, like saying, I'm going to get all these things done, but it really is not the appropriate amount of time for that.
Yeah, because I don't know if you've ever heard of the saying, we tend to underestimate how much we can accomplish in a year and overestimate how much we can accomplish in a day, which I am definitely guilty of sometimes.
Yes.
So, and I am like naturally the kind of person that time can just slip away on me. Like I can just be like in the flow, like doing my things. Like I can be late. Like I so understand that. And it's really common when people start to like looking, like when they start to plan out their weeks to go, oh, I thought something would take me 30 minutes and it took me way longer, and like, screw it, this doesn't work for me. And they just let it go. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple of things that I would share. The first is a mindset shift, is to think that it's not the task that dictates how long something's going to take. It's the person doing the task. So like if you think back to when you were in university and everyone had to write the same exam, some people left way earlier. And I was always that person, like right at the deadline, finishing my last sentence. So it took me longer than it took someone else, but it wasn't the task. It was me doing it. So if you give yourself a reasonable, which we'll get into my second point, if you give yourself a reasonable boundary of time, you can get things done faster. So if you say, I'm going to give myself 30 minutes to accomplish this result, like I'm going to give myself 30 minutes to write this email, then you're more likely to actually have it done in 30 minutes because you've given yourself a boundary, like a time limit.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first. And the second, and people resist me on this one, and then they're like, oh, this was so helpful, is like actually timing out how long things are taking you. So I use an app called Toggle. It's free. You don't have to do it forever. I recommend clients start with it for a couple of weeks. And it's basically, you just record your time, like you hit start and you hit stop, but you can see where your time is going. And then once you're starting to plan out your time, you can see, oh, actually, I used to think that took me 10 minutes, but that actually tends to take me an hour. I know next week I'm going to allot an hour for this. And so I don't have to beat myself up about it. So you're getting that. It's called, it's a habit strategy called monitoring, when you're actually seeing it and you can say like, oh, okay, this takes me this much amount of time when you're looking at it versus just ballparking in your head.
That's so good. Yeah. Cause I think that is like, even if I were to sit there and be like, how much time do I spend on my email? I probably spend more time managing my email than I would say that I probably do. Or, like on your phone, it gives you the, like, how much time you spent on social media this week.
You're
and
like,
it's like,
oh
what?
my gosh.
Like, how did I spend that much time on social media?
How did that happen?
How did that happen? Well, sometimes I'm like, oh, well, it's my phone was left open, and then that's part of it. No, I'm kidding. Like,
it wasn't me.
It wasn't me. It was my kids. My kids were on it. No, but
yeah.
I think you're so correct. Like having that awareness and having that monitoring on those little tasks could, one, give you a better prediction of where you're spending your time so you can plan ahead, and also help bring the awareness to, okay, this is not where I need to be spending my time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like spending 8 hours on social media or whatever is not the best use of your time. So can we then, when we are aware of it now, say, okay, how can I designate and allocate this specific amount of time so that then I get that time back to be able to focus on something else? And so I think it has dual purposes, I would say, in that.
Yeah, absolutely. Because then you can start to really look at where your time is going. And I like to categorize it based on like audience growth activities or client fulfillment activities or selling activities. And then you can get to the end of the week and be like, oh, why didn't I make any money this week? Or why didn't I make any money this quarter if you're doing a launch, for example? And then if you see like, I haven't done any selling activities, that's why I'm not getting anywhere. Or maybe you realize like email can be so time consuming. And so if you're noticing that you're spending a lot of time in your email, or whatever the case may be, but I know email is a big one, you can look at, maybe I need to create a routine so that I'm only looking at my email at the beginning and end of my day. Or maybe you need to give it to an administrative assistant, a VA eventually. So you can see where your time is going. Like the reason you're not moving your business forward is because you're spending 3 hours in your email versus, getting on podcasts or creating something new for your course or and so forth. So it really can be super eye-opening.
Yeah, that's so awesome. Lauren, this has been so great. Do you feel like there's anything that we haven't touched on that you want to make sure we share?
Yeah, I would say that, like, coming back to the mindset piece of it, that, and I think, Renee, I can see from how your kind of philosophy, I'm guessing you would agree with me, is I think we tend to think that we need to be productive and fit into a certain mold. And then we kind of get upset with ourselves when, like, last week I was so strong and this week I wasn't. Like, what's wrong with me? And instead, like, really accepting and being clearer about where you are in your, like, where you are in your cycle, where you are, like, your energy, what kind of style you have around structure and flexibility, and creating systems that actually work for you instead of working against you. Because a lot of people, they'll say, like, oh, I don't like the word systems. That sounds rigid. It doesn't have to be rigid if you create it in a way that's going to work for you and your tendencies, rather than just trying to fit into somebody else's mold.
100%. And I think that is, like, you and I are both in the same program. And so we were both just talking beforehand about how we can take pieces of what they teach and integrate it into what works for us. We can take systems from other people and integrate it into what works for you. And so it really is about taking the best of what everybody else is doing and the tools everybody else is using, and really creating your own, and that thing that really helps you thrive, and learning from other people and having that self-monitoring of knowing, like, okay, this feels in alignment, this doesn't, and, like, this is where I want to lean into. So Lauren, thank you so much for hopping on. If people want to go hang out with you and follow along and learn more from you, where can they find you?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. It was great chatting with you. And yeah, I think we follow very similar ideas and of making systems work for you. So I am on Instagram. You can find me at I am Lauren Monique, LaurenMonique. And I would love to connect with you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. I know Lauren and I both would love if you take a screenshot of this episode, tag both of us. We would love to see it. We'd love to hear your takeaways. And we hope you have a fabulous day.
Yeah, thanks again.